The year is 1453. Constantinople, a city that had stood for over 1,000 years, protected by walls so thick that no army in history had managed to break through them by force. Byzantine defenders lined the ramparts, confident, the way you feel confident locking your front door with a deadbolt that's never failed once in a millennium. Then they hear it. Not an army, not a battering ram, a sound like the sky tearing open. A Hungarian engineer named Orban has built the Sultan a bronze tube 27 feet long, capable of firing a stone ball weighing over half a ton. It takes 60 oxen and hundreds of men just to move it into position. When it fires, the sound is heard 13 miles away, and within weeks, walls that had humiliated crusaders, empires, and armies for over 1,000 years are rubble. So, how did we get here? How did humans go from throwing rocks by hand to building machines that could end a 1,000-year-old empire in a matter of weeks? Let's back up. Way up. To understand the Cannen, you have to understand that humans have always been obsessed with one very specific problem. How do I hurt someone from far away, without them being able to hurt me back? Every weapon in human history is basically a variation on that same question. The spear was better than the fist. The bow was better than the spear. And for thousands of years, the ball, alongside the sling, the catapult, and the trebuchet, was about as good as it got. Then, somewhere in China, sometime around the 9th century, a group of alchemists were doing what alchemists did, trying to create an elixir of immortality. Instead, they created something that could very efficiently do the opposite. They mixed together a handful of naturally occurring substances, a salt-like mineral, a yellow element that smells like rotten eggs, and charred wood. On its own, none of these three things is particularly dangerous. Mixed together in the right way, though, they created something new. A substance that didn't just burn, it exploded. Early Chinese texts actually warned alchemists not to combine these ingredients carelessly, because people kept singeing their beards and burning down buildings by accident. Think about that for a second. Gunpowder wasn't invented by a general looking for a better weapon. It was invented by accident, by people looking for eternal life, who stumbled into one of the most consequential discoveries in military history instead. At first, it wasn't even used as a weapon. It was used in fireworks, in religious ceremonies, as a kind of spiritual special effect. It took decades for anyone to think, wait, what if we put this in a tube and pointed it at people? The earliest gunpowder weapons weren't cannons at all. They were terrifying, half-improvised devices, fire lances, essentially bamboo tubes packed with gunpowder and shrapnel, mounted on the end of spears. A soldier could hold one, light it, and unleash a burst of flame and debris at an approaching enemy. It was crude. It was dangerous to the person holding it, but it worked. And once something works on a battlefield, word travels fast. Over the next couple of centuries, Chinese engineers refined the concept. Bamboo tubes gave way to metal ones. Metal ones got stronger, thicker, more reliable. By the 13th century, actual metal-barreled cannons, capable of launching projectiles, would appearing in Chinese warfare. The oldest surviving bronze cannon we've found dates to around 1298, a squat little bronze tube that looks almost comically small next to what would come later. But it worked on the same basic principle every cannon since has used. Contain an explosion in a tube, and let the only way out be through whatever you've loaded in front of it. And here's where it gets interesting. Because this technology didn't stay in China. It traveled, along trade routes, through the Mongol Empire, which at its height, stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe. The Mongols were remarkably good at two things: conquering enormous amounts of territory, and picking up useful technology from the people they conquered. Gunpowder weapons moved west with them, passed through the Islamic world, and by the early 1300s, had reached Europe. And Europe, fractured, warring, constantly building bigger and better castles to survive constant local conflict, was, in a strange way, the perfect environment for this technology to evolve fast. Think about the incentive structure here for a second. For centuries, European warfare had been an arms race between castle walls and siege equipment. Build a taller wall, someone builds a taller siege tower. Build a moat, someone builds a longer ladder. It was an endless, expensive stalemate. And then suddenly, there's a weapon on the market that doesn't scythe. it just needs to hit it hard enough times. By the mid-1300s, one European cannons were showing up in written records and battlefield accounts. Early versions were often more dangerous to the crew operating them than to the enemy. Metal casting technology wasn't advanced enough yet to reliably contain the pressure of an explosion, so cannons would sometimes crack, or even burst apart entirely, killing the gunners standing next to them. Imagine being one of the first professional cannon operators in history. Your job title barely existed yet. There was no training manual. There was no OSHA. There was just you, a tube of metal, a small explosion contained inside it, and a coin flip chance that the whole thing might kill you before it killed anyone else. That's the prehistoric, medieval, equivalent of being a test pilot for an experimental aircraft with no ejector seat. Except your paycheck was a lord's goodwill, and your safety equipment was hoping for the best. But the technology kept improving. Metalworkers got better at casting bronze and iron. Gunpowder recipes got refined and standardized. And crucially, someone figured out you could make these things bigger, much bigger. Which brings us back to Constantinople. By 1453, the cannon had gone from a battlefield curiosity to a siege-ending weapon of unprecedented scale. Sultan Mehmed II didn't just want a cannon, he wanted the biggest cannon anyone had ever built, and he found an engineer willing to build it. Orban's massive bronze gun, sometimes called the Basilica, could fire once every couple of hours because of how long it took to cool, reload, and reposition. But it didn't need to fire often. It just needed to fire enough times to grind a 1,000-year-old wall into gravel. And it did. Let that sit for a moment. A wall that had defended an empire against Arab armies, Bulgarian armies, and crusaders for over a millennium. Undone in weeks by a weapon that, less than 2 centuries earlier, barely existed outside of Chinese alchemy experiments. Once the cannon proved it could do that, there was no putting it back in the box. Every ambitious ruler in Europe wanted one. Every castle built after this point had to be redesigned with cannon fire in mind, which is actually why fortresses started looking different around this era. Tall, thin medieval walls, great for stopping arrows and ladders, are terrible against cannonballs, because a flat vertical surface takes the full force of an impact. So engineers started building lower, thicker, angled walls, star-shaped fortresses, with sloped surfaces designed to deflect cannon fire, instead of absorbing it head-on. The entire architecture of European warfare rearranged itself around this one piece of technology. Who figured this out first? Who adapted fastest? Who got left behind, clinging to walls that couldn't survive the new reality? These questions defined the next 2 centuries of European power struggles. Now, here's the part of the story that's easy to skip past, because it's less about triumph and more about cost. Because the same weapon that ended a siege in weeks, instead of years, also fundamentally changed who got to hold power. For most of history, warfare had an aristocratic flavor to it. Knights, trained from childhood, wearing armor passed down through generations, engaging in combat that rewarded years of individual skill and inherited wealth. A single knight represented an enormous investment of time, training, and money. A cannon didn't care about any of that. A peasant with minimal training could load, aim, and fire a cannon that could kill an armored knight from hundreds of yards away, a knight whose family had spent a fortune equipping him for exactly the kind of one-on-one combat the cannon rendered obsolete. Gunpowder weapons, cannons especially, quietly and permanently eroded the battlefield, advantage that had justified centuries of feudal hierarchy. If a piece of iron and some black powder could neutralize decades of noble training in a single, explosive instant, what exactly was the aristocracy still defending, militarily speaking? This is the darker turn buried underneath the cool exploding tube story. The cannon didn't just knock down walls. It helped knock down an entire social order that had been built, quite literally, on the assumption that armored elites were militarily irreplaceable. And that transition wasn't clean or bloodless. It played out over centuries, across siege after siege, war after war, as monarchs realized that funding artillery and gunpowder armies was now more valuable than funding knights. Which meant centralizing power, taxing populations harder to pay for it, and slowly reshaping the entire political map of Europe around who could afford the best guns, not the best bloodline. There's also a much darker undercurrent here that historians don't love to dwell on, but can't ignore. The same weapon that reshaped European power struggles also became one of the tools of colonial conquest in the centuries that followed. Empires that mastered gunpowder artillery didn't just use it against each other, they used the same technological gap to devastating effect against societies that hadn't developed equivalent weapons, reshaping entire continents through force enabled largely by this one invention. So when we tell the story of the Cannen as this satisfying arc, accidental discovery, clever refinement, walls falling, empires rising, it's worth remembering that the same object sits at the center of some of history's most consequential violence, inequality, and conquest. Progress and devastation, in this case, are the same invention. So, how did humans invent the Cannen? The honest answer is almost anticlimactic. By accident, through alchemists chasing immortality, refined slowly over centuries by engineers who kept asking, what if this tube were bigger? Until one day, it was big enough to end an empire in a matter of weeks. Think back to those defenders on the walls of Constantinople, listening to a sound like the sky tearing open, watching 1,000 years of security collapse in real time. They weren't just witnessing a battle, they were witnessing the moment the entire logic of warfare, the logic that had shaped human conflict since the beginning of recorded history, quietly and permanently changed. And in a strange way, we're still living in the world that moment created. Every modern conversation about military technology, about weapons that outpace the defenses built to stop them, about who has access to the newest and most devastating tools of power, that conversation started with a group of alchemists in China who were just trying to live forever, and ended up building something that could end civilizations instead. So, next time you see a Cannen sitting quietly in a museum or a park, looking almost decorative, remember what that object actually represents. It's not just an old weapon. It's the moment humanity discovered it could rewrite the rules of power itself, with something no bigger than a tube of metal and a spark. What do you think? Was the Cannen humanity's greatest military innovation, or its most dangerous one? Let me know in the comments.